for that, and thank you for your patience while I sorted out the technical issue of actually accessing my presentation. There has been a lot of interest about corporate governance codes, a lot of research about it. Most of that research, or at least very much of it, is about whether the codes are efficient, whether there is a convergence, whether the corporate governance codes are all going in the right direction. And from a legislative perspective, at least in Norway, and I think this is similar in many other countries, we speak about the corporate governance codes being ahead of the law. So when the Companies Act is changed, then the code is changed as well to be one step ahead. But we rarely discuss in what direction this is going and whether one step ahead is one step ahead in a positive way or just one step in a different direction. And that is part of my starting point. Okay, thank you. I'll just do it the old-fashioned way with the arrows instead. So I'll start by saying a little bit about why I have such a critical analysis, what the context for that is. And then I'll take you through what I see as the triple failure of the corporate governance codes. And then, and this, I've used the term soft law and hard law because that was in the title of the conference. I agree with the criticism of those concepts earlier today. But I will first context and the triple failure, and then whether the answer is to have more law in the traditional sense. So first, the context for my critical analysis. Well, my starting point is that the corporation, or the company as we call it in part of Europe, is an ingenious invention. We've heard about some of the good reasons why today. It's channeled investment to entrepreneurs who wouldn't have been able to get loans in a bank for their great ideas. And it's created jobs and welfare, created products that we need and lots that we don't need, and that's part of the problem. And they are the backbone of our economies. But still, we can't just say, keep going, let's just keep refining the model that we have. Because one thing, in my opinion, is certain in an area where there is much uncertainty and very many things that are difficult to answer, and that is that business as usual is not an alternative. We know from the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, to just mention one area, that we are on a very certain path towards a very uncertain future. So we cannot continue the way that we are. And what companies are doing, business is doing on its own, on a voluntary basis, and with the legislative initiatives that are set into place, is too slow. And in addition, we have the problem with finance, which has moved from being finance for business to becoming a world of its own. Finance for the financiers, where the financial crisis that we have seen is just the tip of the iceberg. And the Panama Papers scandal, which I suppose has been on the news here as well, has revealed a lot of that which has happened, because those who have facilitated those kind of structures that have been published as scandals in the Panama Papers, they are mainstream companies, are big banks, the big four auditing companies, and law firms, big law firms are involved in this. So we have somehow moved from a system where shady deals for something for some shady individuals or businesses right on the fringe of our economy to have this mainstream into our economy. And I think this is all connected. I think this is all about what we here will call shareholder primacy drive, what is called in Norway in the discussion there now the profit maximization pressure, or the culture of greed, as one of my colleagues has called it. And the result is that both the safe and just operating space for humanity is threatened. And what I mean with this, because this is my context for the research that I do, is that we have an environmental ceiling that we need to stay within. It's not just about greener or more environmentally friendly or more sustainable. the research done by Professor Rockström and a long list of co-authors, as they do in the natural science, identified in 2009 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries that we were transgressing. In 2015, this was updated, and then there are 4 out of the 9. And then, as Kate Raworth has said, it's not just about staying within the environmental boundaries, the planetary boundaries, because we can do that by using as little resources as we can. But people are dying every day, thousands of people every day for poverty-related reasons. So we need to achieve a social foundation. We need to use as much resources as necessary, distributed in such a way so that people achieve the fulfillment of their fundamental needs, both now and the future generations. That's why Kate Raworth speaks about living within the donut. So social foundation, but within the environmental ceiling. That's the grand challenge that we face, and that's what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are trying to aim at. They are only trying to aim at it, in my opinion, because they are contradictory in themselves. They don't, for example, discuss whether it's possible to continue stimulating economic growth and still achieve the staying within the planetary boundaries. So that's my context for a critical analysis of the way that business is regulated today. So now the 3 failures. Failure number 1, when it comes to corporate governance codes, and I'm not speaking very generally, there are some exceptions, there are some codes that are really interesting, but the general tendency in corporate governance codes, this convergence that people speak proudly of if they like it, is informed by these postulates that we touched a little bit on before lunch, derived from legal economic theory, where the idea is that we must give as much power as possible to shareholders, because shareholders have a residual interest, and therefore they will only get returns on their investment if everybody else's needs are fulfilled. So it will be good for business and good for society if we let shareholders dominate. And it's a fine theory in itself, but what people tend to forget is that any economic theory is based on assumptions and has its caveats. When it comes to this one important one is externalities. And there's an idea that this is taken care of by other means. And connecting this to my point about finance, starting out this presentation, there's also a theory that the share price actually reflects how the company is run, which totally ignores the fact that the financial markets are a market now in their own right, where we have, and I do not understand why this is legal, we have market makers. You know, we have this computer-run investment in shares, where in Oslo they've discussed whether they should have a rule on the stock exchange that you have to own a share for 1 minute before you can sell it. You know, it's a system on its own right, and on the level of the non-financial business, there's not necessarily any relationship between how the business is run and whether the shareholders get any returns, because the big companies, they publish their policy as regards dividends way ahead. Statoil, one of the largest companies in Norway, a big international company, has done 3 things simultaneously: stuck to its policy about how much dividend it's going to pay to the shareholders, borrowed money because the company is not doing so well now, the oil industry is not doing so well now, and offered all the employees a severance package to try to get rid of as many as possible because they have to downsize. So there's not necessarily any relationship here anymore. And the same postulates that have informed the shareholder primacy drive, this Anglo-American law and economics inspired idea that has dominated and dominates so much of our corporate governance and company law debate, that naturally also informs the corporate governance codes. And we have there the social norm, shareholder primacy, that has become a legal myth. And of course then, when the authors of these corporate governance codes, when they think that companies have a legal duty to maximize returns for shareholders, Of course, they then include provisions in the corporate governance code to reflect that. They think that the shareholders own the companies. Of course, they then talk of them as owners. And in the comparative analysis we did in the international project Sustainable Companies, which grew from a small Nordic project to an international project with 40 team members and 27 jurisdictions represented, we found out that this shareholder primacy drive, that is the main barrier to the necessary shift away from business as usual and onto a sustainable path. And because we saw that there's a perhaps surprisingly large room within company law for business to shift over onto a more sustainable path. But there's a strong social norm / legal myth, so that leads to a very short-term and narrow fixation. Economic incentives that are set into place, share options, bonuses that are meant to make the businesses be run more efficiently. And that makes them be run in a more short-term and narrow sense. Even the investors that you would think would have the longest time horizons of all, the institutional investors, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, when Norway has put all its oil money so we wouldn't get the Dutch disease in Norway. It has a perspective of generations, but the fund managers, they are measured by the quarterly returns, which are set to 5%. So there they have put in a legal duty to do everything that they can to achieve 5%. So that's failure 1. And failure 2, what this leads to is this narrow and short-term fixation that I said on maximization of returns, which leads to legal compliance not being necessarily about complying with the law. And now I remember, Jean, you asked me what I wanted to say in the discussion before. And the one point that I forgot was this compartmentalization of law that is also part of the reason for the state that we're in. Because we think that environmental law can take care of the environment, and human rights law can take care of human rights, and labor law can take care of the employees, so that company law can then just take care of the company, which then through this perverse process has ended being about the shareholders. But it doesn't work that way. And I could speak for a long time about why it doesn't work that way, but I won't do that because I want to get a little bit further before Ken flushes me with 5 minutes. But I've spoken to several people who have the job as legal compliance officers in big companies. And in discussions I said, well, your job is to ensure that the business where you work complies with the law. And they've thought that was an extremely naive statement, because they see their job of preparing a risk analysis of the risk of being caught if we continue what we're doing, which probably violates the law. What kind of fines will we get? So this is this perverse cost-benefit analysis of legal compliance. And in combination, when business doesn't even comply with the law and has this short-term maximization of returns and think that they have a duty to maximize returns for shareholders, then of course any environmental and social impacts of business, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, at least I'm not interested in talking about corporate charity work. I know a lot of the US discussion has been about that. I don't care whether business funds the opera or not. That I'm interested in the impact that business has on people and the environment. And you can call it a nexus of contracts until, I don't know, the sun rises again or something. But business has an impact on people and the environment, and those are treated as externalities unless the business is forced to do otherwise. Of course, now I'm also generalizing. But on an aggregate level, this is a problem, because companies are creatures of national law, as the European Court of Justice has said many times. It's the national legislators that has the possibility to regulate them, because on the international level, it's extremely fragmented. While business and finance, the corporate groups, the networks, and all these layers and layers of shareholders and the rights of the shares split through financial instruments on lots of different hands, that's all international. That's all international. And this drive exploits this combination. They might say, like, the biggest bank in Norway, which is partly controlled by the state, said, well, I'm sure we haven't done anything illegal when their subsidiary in Luxembourg sold the possibility of avoiding tax to Norwegian customers. Of course they were doing something illegal. 5 minutes, that's fine. Failure number 3 is that the attempts at rectifying this are totally superficial. There's been some analysis of the extent to which corporate social responsibility, as it's called, I don't really like that term, and I can explain why in the discussion if anybody wants to know. But the tendency to integrating that into corporate governance codes. And we can see that, and we can also see the kind of contradiction as we touched upon before the break, where there's stakeholders and then shareholders. That's what we really were about. Reporting has become this compromise fix to try to do something about issues that people are concerned about, and is to a very large extent now I lost the word. A deflection device. That's what I meant to say. A deflection device, because people think that human rights are now being integrated into business. But generally speaking, this non-financial reporting, I mean, just listen to non-financial. So it's not about what matters, the finance, but it's about other issues. That kind of reporting is on an aggregated level neither relevant nor reliable. It's the ugliest companies that use the most makeup. There's empirical studies to support this. So generally speaking, and I know I'm insulting both people and businesses here who take this seriously, but on an aggregate level, this is where we are. Where CSR is an add-on, an externality. I analyzed the Norwegian state's ownership report, as they call it, because the Norwegian state is a huge shareholder on the Oslo Stock Exchange. And I can easily list up 7 large companies where the Norwegian state is a shareholder, which have been involved in corruption scandals. So I analyzed their ownership report, and it's maximization of profit, maximization of profit, maximization of profit. Environment, climate, human rights, maximization of profits. So this is integrated everywhere. So you will have understood by now that I do not think that making these codes into hard law, if we can call it that, or legislation adopted by a parliament is the answer. That would just be codifying the problem. But we do need a legal reform. But that requires a totally different approach where we have to see things in context. We cannot just discuss about company law, and definitely not just about reporting. I mean, that's the one area where legislators keep adding more rules. In Norway, we now have 3 layers of CSR reporting rules from different decades. Nobody has bothered to try to make this into a coherent whole. And of course, they're not enforced. The result of the Sustainable Companies Project is that to be able to mitigate this shareholder primacy drive, which is so destructive, requires a redefinition of the purpose of the corporation and of the role and duties of the board in the company's legislation, because it's the lack of a clear definition there in many countries, including Norway, that has given room for the development of this shareholder primacy drive. So in the Sustainable Companies Project, we've prepared a reform proposal which contains the wording that you can see there, and which I'll be happy to discuss more in the Q&A if anybody wants to discuss that. We think it's important to use the language of planetary boundaries in the company's legislation, in these rules that set up the internal workings of the company. But there is much that remains to be done, and we have now been fortunate enough to get funding from the EU, from the EU's framework program Horizon 2020, for a project which starts out as an international project. So if you imagine now sustainable companies that started as a Nordic project with 3 partners and grew into this huge project, we are now starting with 25 partner institutions and 50 scholars named. And of course, we are already now on the way to expanding this. We have the Sustainable Market Actors Network with a lot of wonderful scholars registered there. And we have plans for a whole series of events, and we'll be issuing call for papers. And anybody here who's interested in knowing more, just send me an email or give me your card afterwards. I'd love to include you in this, because I know that there are many people here in the room who are or will be doing that kind of research that will be relevant here, including a comprehensive analysis of the corporate governance codes. So I'm happy to stay in touch, and looking forward to the discussion now. I think I got us 2 extra minutes for the discussion, didn't I?
Yes, you did. You were bestowed 5 extra minutes by because you were doing so well. So.
I didn't know that. No. I'm very strict with people myself when I organize conferences.
That was 20 minutes and 15 seconds. Take it as an example to the rest of you.
I'm impressed. That's my defense.
Yeah, just to kick things off. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was really, like I thought before, I thought we could come to agreement, and your penultimate slide, which is the need to re-theorize and conceptualize the role of the corporation, is exactly what I was suggesting, which is the current thinking doesn't do the job, and more needs to be done. But your point about the makeup, I think, is a really good one. And one thing to add to that is there is this great philosopher in the US called Sarah Palin. And she, and she said, if you put makeup on a pig, it's still a pig.
Yeah.
And that's really what's going on with a lot of the CSR reporting, greenwashing, etc. It doesn't really do what CSR proponents really want it to do, right? And that's because, again, it's seen as an adjunct and afterthought to the main purpose, which is the financial material information. So unless we're able to reimagine materiality as including risks that go beyond just immediate short-term wealth maximization and short-term share movements, you're never going to get to more than makeup. So I think that's why it's important to think of it as more than just window dressing or makeup, but fundamentally part of the calculus that shareholders engage in.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think it's so important that legislators understand how wrong the system is, because they are probably honest in their intentions with what they are doing, like the Norwegian state in its so-called ownership report, because they think they own part of the companies that they have shares in. I don't think they really realize that when they write over and over again, maximize returns on our investment, and then have a nice chapter with their expectations, that they don't realize that is totally insufficient. Because it's only if we realize how totally... Is this going to be put on the internet afterwards? Because I was about to say fucked up. Because then I won't say that. No, I said I didn't say it.
Extreme outlaw
Well, that's fine, as long as it's only Australia.
I think that's a technical word anyway.
Yeah. No. Before they realize that this is a systemic problem, then only when they realize that and realize the extent of it, then they can start realizing what kind of changes they need to make, because they still seem to see any scandal, any problem, as a minor problem in a machinery that otherwise works fine. So I've started saying that to the media back home in Norway now when they ask me about some scandal or other, and goodness me, how many there have been in the last few years with these really huge companies. You know, I mean, we're not talking about people you would think were crooks to start with. And so I've started saying, I'm tired of these scandals, because it's the same thing. And the Norwegian Ministry of Trade, they then ask the chair of the board to give them a report on what has happened, and then somebody is very sad. This is the latest thing. Before, we had this Norwegian expression about laying down flat. That's what they used to say when they were really, and they'd been caught, done something wrong. Okay, totally lay down flat. But now this has become so much of a cliche that now the PR advisors have advised them to use new language. So nowadays, I'm really sad to learn that these things have happened in the company that I'm responsible for. Of course, this is not what we had wished, and then they just look forward and move on, and it's business as usual until the next scandal.
I'm happy to keep the queue if you want to show me your hand. I'll keep a queue of next speakers.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I will definitely be in touch. I'm really interested in your work, and I really enjoyed your presentation. I will be at the panel discussion afterwards, so then I might have a few other things, but just on your conclusion, because I think due to time you did not have so much time to actually elaborate on that.
No,
you
I can go back to that if you
yes,
want.
because
This one.
how I understood it is you concluded that hard law is not the answer, but legal reform is.
No, I meant that turning the corporate governance
Yes.
codes into hard law,
Yes.
that is not the answer,
Yes, yes.
because they are, generally speaking, on the wrong path.
Yes, I
Mhm.
got that like
Yeah.
that. But legal reform is necessary, so a
Mhm.
different approach. And then you said a redefinition of the purpose of the company, roles and directives of duties are necessary. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit just on that last part, please?
Yes, because in the Sustainable Companies Project, we also did some empirical work on the perception of board members and CEOs. And many of them would have liked to run the company in a different way, but they think that they have a duty to maximize returns for shareholders. And from a European, not UK, but continental and Nordic European perspective at least, I think it's important to go back to our roots and codify what was actually meant all the time from the legislators, that the boards should have a broader duty to take into account various interests, and not just take into account in the UK Companies Act way, but to actually balance
Yeah,
them.
that's what I was wondering, to what an extent you actually.
Yeah, because what the proposal, the reform proposal that we have, it's to redefine the corporate purpose to be creating sustainable value within the planetary boundaries, while respecting the interests of its investors and other involved parties. This could be worded in lots of different ways, of course. And then when it comes to the duty of the board, it's to promote life cycle-based sustainable value creation, because what we see a lot in international trade is that business is split up into lots of different legal entities, which each has only responsibility for its own, the damage that it does, its own creditors and so on. So we think when it comes to the part of business that makes money on products, that we need to include a life cycle-based thinking, so that the board would have a duty to draw up a sustainable business plan in the really long term, like 15 to 30 years. What is this company going to earn money on? Okay, it's a product. Well, is the life cycle of that product within the planetary boundaries? Because in that way, we could then also give content to those often nicely worded reporting requirements. So we could have an enforceable requirement of having to draw up such a sustainable business plan, and then key performance indicators would have to be selected by the company, connected to what they have written in that business plan, connected to the life cycle of the products that they sell. And that would also be verified by experts, and then they could report on that annually. So that's the
Yes, thank you.
idea.
I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask the next point, or make the next point.
So two things. So back in January, at the annual Law Professors Conference in the U.S., I was asked to debate Frank Easterbrook about the state of law and economics 40 years after. So you know, he's this famous federal judge now, and he was got up in front of everyone and said that there were no third-party effects to the global financial crisis. So the level of self-delusion is and I said, I can't believe you can say that with a straight face. We're all third-party effects, and so we had a nice exchange, but that's the level of self-delusion that you see in the U.S. at least. The other point that I think is interesting with this last slide, if you think of, and this is a part that one of the components or characteristics of the corporation that you don't focus on, but and Lynn Stout just has this new paper about how a corporation is the best mechanism for intergenerational investment that we have, right? That is, it allows for long-term investment that's uncoupled from families. And so if you think about corporations, instead of, like, if we were able to release it from the short-termism that so plagues everybody, the corporation is actually this perfect mechanism for long-term investment and long-term thinking.
It's an ingenious invention to start with, yeah.
So, but the problem is, how do you incentivize management to think in those terms rather than in the short term?
Yeah, because there's nothing in the law that intends for this kind of short-termism at all, and it's bad for business. It's bad for including the employees, bad for society, and it's bad for any shareholder that has more than a very, very short-term perspective. And they will say that they want them to be long-term, and especially like the pension funds, they are by definition long-term, but they do not understand the consequence of then having these short-term measurements of whether they are run in an efficient and good way. So it's a very, very big discussion to be had, which also goes back to what we touched upon before lunch, that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts.
I just wondered if you looked at the extent to which integrated reporting sort of is consistent with the objectives, although again that's about reporting theoretically, and I don't like the use of the concept of capitals that they use in integrated reporting, but I wondered if you looked at how closely the ultimate objectives of that are consistent with what you're suggesting. But also the other point I wanted to make is that, it's a sort of, I wouldn't say a rich tapestry, but there's a tapestry here involved, and it's not just managements who are involved in short-termism. There's a lot of people playing different roles. You have, you're looking at, look at the global financial crisis, and there were credit rating agencies, there were analysts, there's governments, there's regulators, there's retail investors who want to see return.
Yes.
How do you, that's second and sort of unrelated point, but how do you deal with all those sort of role players in this?
Well, I think the first step is to put together an international research group with a really big network to support it, because seriously, it's there's a lot of pieces that have to be put into place. But to go to your first point, in these two first books, which are both from the Sustainable Companies Project, there are chapters in both on reporting, written by Professors Charlotte Villiers from the UK and Jukka Meonen from Finland. And in one of them, they discuss especially this with integrated reporting. And there are some interesting tendencies there. And there's also some interesting things in the new reporting, relatively new now, reporting requirements from the EU. But as it is now, it falls short from being anything that can change things efficiently enough, at least. And my hypothesis on this has always been that the reason that these reporting requirements don't work is because they are not linked to any duties of the board. So the duty, and then it gets even worse when the board thinks it has a duty to maximize returns for shareholders, and then it is told that it must report on these other issues. And that's why we want to link that, because I think if you have a duty to do something which you then should report on, then you actually have a possibility of making a system out of this that could work. But you need to start taking it seriously. Like in Norway, we've had this very good environmental protection reporting requirement since the 1980s. The wording is really good, and if that was taken seriously, Norwegian companies would get greener and greener year for year, because it's really progressive. But it's not enforced. It's in the Annual Accounts Act, so it's a criminal offence not to report properly. But empirical studies show that 9 out of 10 of the biggest companies in Norway don't report according to this rule. And then to your second question, is I'm very glad you asked that question, because it's a very, very important point. I mean, I mentioned before lunch that I think that we should recognize that the agency theory can be much more than the two mainstream issues that are usually discussed, where the board is agent for the shareholders, or the majority shareholders are agents for the minority shareholders. There's a huge set of agency issues in a legal economic sense involved in a business. For those who might be interested, I've written a paper about some of those. But there's also, with these new developments, there's also what we can call secret agents. We don't know who's actually taking the decision. Like the credit rating agencies, the financial analysts who phone to the CEO and say, your share price has just dropped. Are you going to sell that? Sell that factory or not? And all these through these financial instruments, this decomposing of shares. So we cannot even say anymore that shareholders have a general interest, which we think we know what is, because somebody voting for a share at a general meeting might have an interest in that company not doing well. Because it's extremely split up, and there are so many layers. I have a PhD student who's working on that, and she gives very good presentations on that. And we also have, from the banking crisis in Iceland, Gudrun Johnsen, who was on the investigative committee there. If you Google her, we've filmed her when she's done presentations, so it's on YouTube, bringing down the banking system, lessons from Iceland. You can see these images that are not made up. They are analysis of the cross shareholdings. There was no money anyway, because there were these extreme cross shareholdings. It looks like spiders on speed that have overlapping spider webs. So it's so complex and so far from what these original mainstream legal economic theories are about.
Let's